Hello, everyone. This is Lefteris Kafatos with the Japan Lens. Today, we are so happy to welcome Mr. Glen Fukushima, who has kindly taken time from his busy schedule to meet with us today and share his deep insights. Before we dive into the questions, I would like to introduce Glen. Glen is a third-generation American of Japanese ancestry from the state of California. He attended the college at Deep Springs and also at Stanford University and did his graduate studies at Harvard University. He was also an exchange student at the prestigious Keio University and a Fulbright Fellow at the University of Tokyo. Glen has been engaged in U.S.-Japan relations since the 1970s, both as a student, an academic, a lawyer, government official, business executive, think tank researcher, nonprofit member, and also a philanthropist. Most notably, Glen was senior official at the USTR, the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative. And additionally, he was selected twice as the president of the American Chamber of Commerce in Japan, the ACCJ. Since 2002, Glen has served as the vice chair of the Securities Investor Protection Corporation, or SIPC, which is a position nominated by the President of the United States and requiring Senate confirmation. He is also a well-respected commentator who often appears on numerous prestigious shows all over the world, most notably in Japan. So, Glen, thank you again so much for being here today.
Well, good to be with you. Thank you.
So, I would like to just dive in the interest of time. I have some questions. I'd like to start with the Japanese economy, if that's all right.
Sure.
So some say that Japan's shrinking population and so-called the uncompetitive nature of its economy all but ensure its decline. Others disagree, such as Maria Solis or perhaps Ulrike Schade at UCSD. These folks say that, in fact, Japan is pivoting towards smarter ways of competing in the global economy. So, if you don't mind, could you share how do you gauge the health of Japan's economic competitiveness in the next decade? Is there a lot of cause for optimism?
Well, I think a lot depends on your definition, competitiveness and success and so forth, because I think on a macro level, there's no doubt that with the declining population, aging population, that Japan's share of the world's GDP, for instance, is declining. No
Hmm.
question about that. Population is declining. The scale of the economy compared to China, India, Indonesia, so macros. Speaking on a macro level, there's no doubting that the indicators are on the downward trend for Japan. At the same time, it's true that Japan is still one of the most stable, livable countries in the world.
Hmm.
They have, uh, they have more Michelin three-star restaurants in Tokyo than any city in the world. The trains run exactly on time. Uh, Relatively low crime. It's clean, it's safe, it's comfortable. So on a micro level, Japan in general, but especially Tokyo and the large cities, are very attractive places to live. It's also the case that individuals, as well as individual companies, can do very well in Japan, both Japanese companies as well as non-Japanese companies. So if you want to look at the successes, then you can look at individual cases of corporations that are very successful around the world, or of individuals who have been quite successful, well, however you want to define that, but especially economically in Japan. So I think you can see elements of both. And
Hmm.
for those who say Japan is definitely on the decline, I have to say, well, but there are all these cases of corporations and individuals that are successful and are, doing well. But also on a macro level, there's no question that comparatively compared to these other countries that I mentioned, Japan is declining. So I think you need to look at both.
I see. A lot is made of the the large debt ratio. How do you find that to be concerning as the population declines, or
Oh,
what's your take
sure.
on that?
Yeah, I mean
Hmm.
that issue of debt to GDP is a huge issue that Japan has been trying to deal with. I guess the thing that makes Japan different from say countries like Thailand or Indonesia or South Korea has been that most of the debt is domestic, and
Hmm.
therefore there isn't much fear that the economy is going to crater and it has to be bailed out by the IMF or others the way that some other countries whose debt is dependent so much on external factors. So, although it is an issue, and certainly with the aging population, the burden is increasingly on the proportion of the population that's younger is having to provide for the medical insurance and social welfare and social security payments of the pensions of the elderly, and so
Hmm.
that certainly is a real concern. And so, I mean, as you know, Japan is trying to deal with it to some extent with a limited amount of, I guess some people would say immigration, some people would say imported labor, because immigration itself is still a rather sensitive issue among some, and also with automation. And
Hmm.
Japan is one of the most advanced countries in terms of robotics. And
Hmm.
and then in addition to the imported labor and robotics, there is an attempt to try to tap women and people over the age of say 65, which until recently have been considered to be, retirees. Uh, both with the population, the demographics being what they are, there are ways in which Japan has tried to cope with this, and in varying degrees of success.
Hmm. Yeah, I always wonder, it must be a challenging position for Japan to feel like it's standing between its largest defense partner, the United States, and then its largest trading partner, China, and to be kind of standing between those two, and then
Yeah,
wondering
well,
that.
that's an issue of constant interest and concern in Japan is the
Hmm.
relationship with the United States and with China, because as you say, in terms of the political and security relationship, the United States is by far the most important country. But
Hmm.
in terms of economics, I think since about 2010, China has become the largest trading partner of Japan, and and investment has seen ups and downs. But in terms of trade itself, Japan and China, the trade is increasing, and yeah, so I predicted probably 15 years ago. I remember actually at a Council on Foreign Relations meeting about 15 years ago, I said in the future Japan will face this issue of the growing economic dependence on China, but the continuing security and political dependence on the United States. And most of the people who attended, many of the Americans, kind of poo-pooed this and didn't understand what I was talking about. But I think the trends were pretty clear, and I think it's an ongoing issue.
Hmm.
And one of the things I find interesting is that, many people in Japan will say that the nightmare scenario for Japan is that the United States and China become too friendly with each other, and it becomes a G2, and Japan becomes marginalized. On the
Hmm.
other hand, Japan really doesn't want the United States and China to get into any major conflicts or have huge tensions, because
Hmm.
that means there'll be pressure on Japan to have to choose between one or the other. And so they don't want to do that either. So I think from Japan's point of view, the ideal state is to have a certain amount of tension between the United States and China, so as to make Japan valuable for both, but not have too much tension, because that would it could potentially marginalize Japan.
I see. Yeah. Well, that actually ties into my next question, which is the upcoming. We'll see the inauguration of a second Trump presidency next month. Um, as you know, former President Trump has announced that he might issue strong tariffs against various nations, Japan included, come January 2025. There's also an emblematic issue in the U.S. steel deal and the troubles plaguing that issue, as you know, have caused quite a bit of consternation in Japan. What advice do you have for companies on both sides of the Pacific, both Japanese and American companies, as they try to navigate this new age of American protectionism?
Well, I think the basics are the same as before, which is that you have to be flexible and you have to really kind of make sure that you know what's going on. What I mean by that is that I think traditionally, business people are generally trained to look at the return on investment and the economic indicators. And and up to now, I think that's been the ability to market, the ability to raise money, the technology, those kind of economic and business factors have been the key, whether
Mhm.
it's American companies or Japanese companies. But I think with rising protectionism, the extra economic factors, the non-economic factors become increasingly important to follow.
Mhm.
And so, for instance, I mean, to give you one specific example, is the U.S. Steel and Nippon Steel case, where from a business point of view, when that proposed acquisition was announced in December of last year, the initial reaction in the United States among the business analysts was this is a great deal. It's good for Nippon Steel, it's good for U.S. Steel, it's good for the steel workers, it's good for American auto producers. And for shareholders. And so this is a great deal.
Mhm.
But then, a few days later, it turned out that U.S. members of Congress, Senate, well, certainly, John Casey, or Bob Casey, the Pennsylvania senator, John Fetterman, the Pennsylvania senator, J.D. Vance, the Ohio senator, Sherrod Brown, Ohio senator, all these senators and several members of Congress came out in opposition. And then I think Bob Lighthizer came out in opposition, former U.S. Trade Representative under President Trump. And then Trump came out in opposition, and eventually Joe Biden came out in opposition. But so from an economic point of view, it might have been a good deal, but from a political point of view, the fact that this is a presidential election year, number one, Biden has said he's the most pro-union president in American history, and he picketed with the United Auto Workers during their strike. Um, uh, former President Trump and Bob Lighthizer have a real attachment to steel as an industry in terms of the whole Make America Great Again. Steel plays an important role. Also, Pennsylvania being such a battleground state where, in 2016, Hillary Clinton lost Pennsylvania by 45,000 votes. And in 2020, Biden won Pennsylvania by 81,000 votes. So it really is a swing state.
Mhm.
So all these factors, had to be factored in, and unfortunately, I think Nippon Steel didn't consider those non-economic factors. So,
Mhm.
but so to answer your question, I think it's important for companies to clearly focus not only on the economic aspects and business aspects, but also on the political environment and
Mhm.
what that means in terms of impact on the ability for companies to do business. And in fact, in 2015, 2017, I was invited by Kyoto University School of Management to teach a course on government business relations. And I relied on my experience at USTR and also 22 years working in business in Japan and Asia, and used a lot of cases from Harvard Business School, Stanford, Chicago, and Northwestern, MIT, and others on the relation between government and business, and especially in areas like telecommunications, IT, um, semiconductors, especially in advanced technology, but also in infrastructure, telecommunications, transportation, it's hard to avoid the impact of governments. And so that's, I think, increasingly the case.
Mm. Very prescient points, and so timely and relevant even now. Um, so that brings me to my next question about kind of like the atmosphere or the environment in which this business takes place. As you know, in 2021 to 22, then Prime Minister Kishida espoused his new capitalism idea. He even wrote a book about it. And he presents this as kind of a counter to American capitalism, um, which he says was unfortunate in that it produces there are winners and there are losers in American capitalism, and it's whereas in his new capitalism idea, there's less of emphasis on the shareholders and more on the stakeholders, like it's a more holistic view. So, having been involved in these U.S.-Japan relations for so many years, how do you assess Japanese style capitalism versus the American variety? Do you think that something, do you think that either model works in the other? Could Japanese style capitalism work in the US or vice versa? Could a more, American style variety take root and do well in Japan, in your opinion?
Well, this is a really interesting question. And as you say, since the actually 1982 to 83, I was on the Fulbright Fellowship at the University of Tokyo. And my topic for research was antitrust law and policy in Japan. And I was trying to compare it to American antitrust law and policy. And one of the major differences, among many, is that antitrust operates in a different environment in the United States and Japan, and it's precisely this area of the forms of capitalism.
Mm,
And so when Prime Minister, actually, I think it was before Prime Minister Kishida became Prime Minister, that during the LDP presidential election, he proposed this idea of a new capitalism. Initially, a lot of people were intrigued by it, but as time went by, it seemed that he kept kind of changing what he meant
mm,
by the
mhm,
term. And after a while, I think it kind of sputtered out. And so it didn't really catch hold. But I think that to give it some historical perspective, I think at the end of the Cold War, after the Berlin Wall fell in November of 1989 and the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, this whole competition between capitalism and communism, or capitalism and socialism, was seen to have withered away. And then a lot of economists and sociologists and political scientists talked about the three forms of capitalism.
mm,
And that was the Anglo-American form of the US and the UK, the German or Rhine form of continental Europe, and the Asian form of capitalism, which Japan represented. And so people like Ronald Dorr, the famous sociologist in Britain, would write about these issues and others. And and there's a really interesting comparisons among these three types of capitalism. And essentially, what I've come to the conclusion is that among the G7 countries, the United States and Japan are the polar opposites. And the UK is closer to the US. Germany, France, and Canada, Italy are in between the US
mm,
and the UK on the one hand and Japan on the other by a whole variety of measures. And you can measure, income inequality or membership on corporate boards, to what extent they're open, to what extent they have independent board members or not, the compensation of senior executives. There's like
mhm,
probably 30 different indicators you can look at. And
mm,
so uh, at the same time, there's been change in each of these countries, so that in the case of Japan, if you compare, 30 years ago and now, there have been some significant changes in Japan in terms of boards, which used to be completely internal, now there's requirements that Japanese companies have, especially those that are listed on Tokyo or on stock exchanges,
Hmm.
that they be open to non um, company people,
Hmm.
external board members, so-called independent board members, although that's a issue of some contention in terms of what the definition of independent is. Also in Japan, there's more not only outside directors, but also women and also
Hmm.
non-Japanese who've doing corporate boards. I mean, Sony was one of the very early ones. I think Pete Peterson, I think, was the first non-Japanese board member of a major Japanese company when he became board member. Actually, my wife, Sakie, was the first woman board member of Sony. So there's been change in the last 20 to 30 years. But at, at the same time, although Kishida did focus on the fact that Japanese capitalism, in his view, created too many inequalities, number one, and also didn't pay enough attention to things like climate change and
Hmm.
environmental issues,
Hmm.
and also didn't pay enough attention to disparities between the urban and rural areas. And those are many areas in which I think that Japan does pay more attention than the United States. And I think it was like 4 years ago, I was asked by the Council on Foreign Relations to give a presentation comparing American and Japanese capitalism and whether there are things that the United States can learn from Japan. And I think it's quite difficult, actually, although I think it was also about maybe 6 years ago or so that the Business Roundtable in the United States came out with a statement saying, up to now we've been so focused on shareholders, but we realized that we really have to focus more on stakeholders, not only shareholders. And this was a response, I think, to the fact that there were some public opinion polls indicating that, especially among younger Americans, that there was an increasing criticism of capitalism and
Hmm.
all the inequalities that it had created, and also and less of a opposition to socialism.
Hmm.
Now, the definition of socialism is also quite interesting because the young Americans who are responding to these questionnaires, public opinion polls, saying that they are more receptive to socialism, they're not talking about government owning the means of production, and they're not talking about kind of rationing and the really hard kind of Soviet model of government taking over control of the economy. They're talking more about kind of democratic socialist type of ideas that
Hmm.
Senator Bernie Sanders was talking about. So the definition of socialism, is often vague and needs to be
Hmm.
precisely defined. But I do think that among younger people in Japan, there's an increasing realization that the inequalities and disparities of income and wealth in the United States is really a really negative factor for American society. And this is
Hmm.
produced in large part based on the capitalist system that the U.S. Adheres to. And so in terms of rhetoric, there is rhetoric in the United States saying, "Oh yeah, we have to, be more open. We have to consider these disparities and the role of the corporation." Unlike what Milton Friedman said in his book Capitalism and Freedom, which I read in Econ 101 as an undergraduate at Stanford, it's the only purpose. The only purpose of a corporation is to maximize profits for shareholders. That's the only purpose of a corporation, according to Milton Friedman. Now, that's a pretty extreme position that I think most people in Japan would reject,
Hmm.
because in Japan, the purpose of a corporation actually is to provide jobs and to provide economic welfare and for the society. And so that's why Japan has these labor laws and practices that make it extremely difficult to fire people.
Hmm.
And, I mean, that's a plus and a minus. And so this is an issue that we could spend the next 2 hours talking about, but I think it's clear that the two forms of capitalism in the US and Japan are quite different. And although there are attempts rhetorically in the United States to move a little bit towards the Japanese model, and in practice, Japan is moving slowly more towards the American model, but still the two are very, very different. And one indicator, which I think is very, very important, is the disparity between the CEOs of companies and the average worker. And I think in Japan, it's something like, I don't know, maybe depending on which study you look at, it's somewhere between 50 to 60, and the United States was like 350. And it didn't used to be that way in the United States. Up through about 1960s or so,
Hmm.
U.S. disparity wasn't that high. But
Hmm.
now its disparities are incredibly large. And
The that
it,
references to the average pay of the employee times a factor of 50 or 60 in Japan versus times a factor of 350
well,
in the
so
US.
according to these studies, they're comparing the compensation for CEOs of a company
Hmm.
versus compensation. In some studies, it's the entering workers. In some cases, it's the average compensation for workers of that same company.
I see.
So it depends on the study, but there's no question that there's like I think probably a 5 to 6 times greater difference in the United States compared to Japan. In fact, I remember I was on the board of several Japanese companies, and one of them was a major Japanese financial institution, one of the major banks in Japan.
Hmm.
I still remember when I was a board member that the CEO of one of the top three banks in Japan was making under $1 million total compensation for the year. His counterpart in the United States was making something like 35 million. So in that case, it was 35 times, not 5 or 6 times. So that's, I mean, that's just to me one clear indicator of how um, capitalism is quite different in the two countries. I mean,
Hmm.
among many things, that was one of Carlos Ghosn's issue. You know, when Carlos Ghosn had the problems in Japan, from his point of view, I mean, from the Japanese point of view, Carlos Ghosn was making so much money compared to his counterparts in Japan, like the CEOs of Toyota and Nissan and Honda. Or sorry, he was at Nissan, but his predecessors at Nissan, like Hanawa,
Hmm.
as well as the CEOs of Honda and Toyota and probably Suzuki as well,
Hmm.
making so much less than Carlos Ghosn. And so Carlos Ghosn was looking at the world auto industry and seeing that the CEO of GM or of Ford or of Volkswagen were making so much more than he was. So
Hmm.
I mean, that's just kind of one element of this disparity and difference in capitalism between Japan and the rest of and the United States and Europe.
That's so interesting. And as you mentioned, there is a move, there's these slow changes happening, especially in Japan. Do you think that Japan will more readily adopt, is more likely to adopt large portions or large chunks of the characteristics of American capitalism versus the reverse? Or do you think that culturally speaking, the barriers to entry are high regardless?
Yeah, I don't know whether it's, cultural or not, but I think that there are limits to what Japan is going to import from the United States when it comes to corporate governance. Um, because, fundamentally, my view is that Japan is a society that uh, likes continuity, stability, predictability.
Mhm.
And so uh, unless there's some overriding reason to institute significant change, people will pretty much follow precedent and continue what they've been doing. So I think the view is if it ain't broke, don't try to fix it. And also I think compared to the United States, where if there's even a small degree of dissatisfaction with the status quo, there's often a tendency to throw out everything and to try something new. And so there's a sense that risk is good in the United States, especially if it produces good results. And even if it doesn't produce good results, we can try again. And
Mhm.
so in the United States, it's often better to take action, even if it produces bad results, rather than to not take action. Whereas in Japan, I think the view is more to not change unless it's absolutely necessary to make changes. And I think when people in Japan look at the income and wealth disparities in the United States and the kind of social problems that creates, I think that Japan is going to be very, very careful in incorporating elements of corporate governance from the United States.
Yeah.